Meryl Streep, not merely the greatest actress of her time, but the very measure of artistic excellence and the irreplaceable heartbeat of Hollywood. From the shattering pain of Sophie's Choice, to the icy precision of The Devil Wears Prada, to the unyielding will of the Iron Lady, she did not simply expand the boundaries of acting, she compelled an entire industry to redefine them. For more than half a century, she has not just shown, she has become the standard by which all others fade into obsolescence. With 21 Academy Award nominations, 3 wins, and over 30 Golden Globe nominations, she has not only conquered Hollywood, she has shaped the way history itself is remembered. Audiences do not merely watch her, they find themselves within the silences she leaves behind, within the emotions she never speaks, yet never allows to disappear. And yet, behind the performances that defined an era, stands a woman forged in silence, carrying losses no applause could ever wash away. And today, at 76, as the applause softens, and the world still whispers her name with reverence, has peace truly stayed with her? If she has ever made you feel less alone in your darkest days, then subscribe and offer a quiet tribute to the woman who redefined greatness. Crushed quietly under expectations she could not yet name, Meryl Streep entered the world not as a presence, but as an absence that learned how to observe. Behind her thick glasses, she hid a face that rarely drew notice. In a world that rewarded beauty and boldness, she carried neither like a shield. She stood just outside the frame, watching, absorbing, understanding. Born on June 22, 1949 in Summit, New Jersey, her life appeared stable on the surface, yet inside something far more complex was taking shape. Her father believed in order, discipline, control. Her mother believed in possibility, freedom, boundless expression. Asked to become both, she did not grow, she divided. Perfect yet unrestrained, grounded yet limitless. Those contradictions did not build strength, they quietly dismantled certainty. At school, she was not rejected, but she was never fully reached. In a space where girls were rewarded for shining, she learned instead how to fade. Years later, she would only admit she had long felt slightly out of place in her own life. The night she was voted prom queen should have confirmed her place. Instead, it exposed something deeper. Applause came too quickly, too certain. She stood a fraction too still, hands unsure, smile arriving too late. Faces turned toward her, bright, convinced, celebrating something they believed they saw. But as she stepped forward, something inside her did not move with her. It stayed behind, watching. For a brief second, everything slowed. The laughter, the light, the weight of being chosen. And then, a quiet rupture. She searched for herself and could not find her. And for the first time, a colder thought followed close behind. What if she had never truly been there at all? Not in their eyes, not in the version they applauded. In that instant, something settled with unsettling clarity. She had been seen, but not known. I remember standing there and feeling like I wasn't inside the moment at all, she would later admit. Tension sharpened when music entered her life, not as comfort, but as confrontation. At 12, under the rigorous guidance of Estelle Liebling, she developed control with exact precision, every breath measured, every note placed. Her voice could fill a room, but something within remained untouched. During one lesson, as everything aligned, she felt it. Not doubt, but absence. The sound was right, but it did not belong to her. No mistake, no correction. Only the awareness that she was producing something convincing without inhabiting it. In that moment, the distance between expression and truth became impossible to ignore. It was no longer about technique. It was about what might be lost if she continued. She stepped away, not in defiance, but in recognition, because continuing would mean learning how to perform without being present. And if she stayed, she knew she might never fully come back to herself. From that fracture came a rule she would never speak aloud, yet never betray. If she gave something to the world, it had to come from somewhere real. In high school, she stepped briefly into visibility, joining the cheerleading squad, accepting admiration. But the pattern did not change. Attention came, but it never settled. Approval shifted without reason. Instead of chasing it, she studied it, how quickly it arrived, how easily it disappeared, how little of it ever stayed with her. That distance became instinct. What looked like control was, beneath the surface, a way of staying intact. Then, quietly, something shifted when she found the stage. Acting did not arrive as ambition, it arrived as relief. For the first time, she no longer had to negotiate her place. Within each role, she found alignment. By stepping into other lives, she gathered the fragments she had kept apart, the unseen child, the divided self, and shaped them into something whole. On stage, silence carried weight. Restraint became presence. She was no longer trying to belong, she simply existed. These performances were not built for applause, they were built from necessity. What the world would later call brilliance had already been forming, through years of adaptation, through a life spent learning how to meet expectations without losing herself. And that is why her work reaches beyond performance, because beneath every moment lies something unmistakably real. She stepped into the light, but not all of her ever followed. What would later be called greatness began in a place that felt almost impossible to endure. In 1971, at just 22, Meryl Streep entered the Yale School of Drama, a place many revered as the pinnacle of artistic training, but for her it became a space where each passing hour demanded more than she could safely keep for herself. More than a dozen plays each year, rehearsals stretching into exhaustion, coursework piling up, and side jobs slipping into every rare gap, everything fused into a rhythm that refused to slow. By 1973, her body began to speak in a way she could no longer ignore. A bleeding stomach ulcer, silent but insistent. One night, standing backstage, her hand pressed against her abdomen, she felt the tightening pain rise in waves. Harsh yellow light cut through the curtain as it tightened beneath her hand. As she closed her eyes, not to rest, but to keep from collapsing. I can't keep this up, but I can't stop. Then the cue came and she stepped out, not because she was ready, but because there was no other choice. The next morning began again in fragility, a dry throat, a room so quiet she could hear her own breathing, and a single thought repeating, "Am I still enough to continue?" The doubt in others' eyes slowly became a voice she carried inside herself. There were moments sitting before law school applications when her hand hovered over the page, as if one signature could release her from all of it. In a rare moment of letting her guard fall, she admitted to a friend that if this path required so much, she might not be able to see it through. And yet within those fractures, something deeper held her in place, because acting was no longer just a dream, but the only place where she could gather the pieces of herself that felt like they were slipping away. What came next did not ease the weight, it only proved how much more she could carry. When she left Yale in 1975 at 26, she carried a body worn to its edges, but something within her had become harder to break. New York welcomed her not with opportunity, but with a small room where light barely slipped through a narrow window, and a handful of off-Broadway roles. No bright spotlights, no full houses. There were nights when she stepped onto the stage and looked out to rows of empty seats stretching into silence, so still she could hear the faint brush of fabric as she moved. And yet, in that emptiness, she learned how to continue without being seen, and still exist fully within each role. In 1976, she played Helena in A Midsummer Night's Dream, in a production so modest it barely extended beyond its own walls, yet something in her resisted disappearing. A critic observed that she did not simply appear and fade, she remained quietly in the mind. It was the first indication that attention had begun to settle, but doubt did not loosen. It stayed close, in every casting room, in every unanswered call, in every silence that followed effort. She questioned whether she fit what was expected, whether absence of response was itself an answer. Rejection did not arrive loudly, it accumulated until it felt inevitable. And still she returned, again and again. What she built in those years was not confidence, It was endurance shaped into form. In 1977, the smallest opening shifted everything. A brief role in Julia, only minutes on screen, yet enough to alter how people paused, looked, considered. Enough for a question to begin forming, who is she? Enough for a door, not wide, not welcoming, but real, to move. What would later be called success did not begin in triumph. It began here, through work that left its marks, through scarcity that tested resolve, through a quiet refusal to step away when nothing seemed to change. She did not move forward because the path was clear. She moved forward because she remained. And in that choice, repeated when it gave nothing back, she became something that had already been pushed to the edge and had chosen again and again not to disappear. She did not step into the frame as a sudden burst of light. She forced her way through the dark with an endurance that would not be extinguished. In 1977, Meryl Streep first appeared on screen in Julia, a role so brief it could have been overlooked on paper, yet powerful enough to alter the atmosphere of the room. It lingered, not because of its length, but because something within it would not fade. A year later came The Deer Hunter, 1978, where her restraint no longer felt like performance, but as if she were holding back something too vast to release in front of others, held long enough to reveal what lay beneath. Away from the camera, her life narrowed into two parallel paths: the demands of the set and the quiet stillness of hospital corridors, where the air carried that faint, sterile chill. During filming, she remained beside John Cazale, the man she loved, as lung cancer steadily diminished his body and drew time inward. Every line she delivered seemed weighted with counted breaths, the low hum of machines, the fragility of each passing moment, and the quiet awareness that every parting could be the last. She would later describe those months as both tender and unbearable, loving without reserve while learning, step by step, how to let go, standing beneath hot lights while something irreplaceable slipped further away. The film brought her first Academy Award nomination and more than $48 million worldwide on a modest budget, yet the greater shift happened within. She was no longer waiting for permission to move forward. She was already there, grief held steady, truth placed directly into the frame, and no longer shaped into something easier to accept. Nothing softened, it sharpened quietly into something more exact. By 1979, Kramer vs. Kramer unfolded with the inevitability of something already forming long before it was seen. As Joanna, she occupied the frame for only minutes, yet those minutes held attention so precise it felt almost unbearable to watch. The restraint, the silence, the emotion contained rather than offered. It did not feel performed, it felt revealed. The role earned her first Academy Award, while the film gathered 5 Oscars and surpassed $170 million globally, an extraordinary reach for a story built on fracture rather than spectacle. With that recognition came momentum, offers, visibility, a system that invited her to remain constantly seen, but she moved differently. She stepped back from what demanded display, held the edges of her private life with quiet discipline, treated recognition as something external rather than defining. The early 1980s moved quickly: The French Lieutenant's Woman, Silkwood, 1983, and Sophie's Choice, 1982. For Sophie, she absorbed language, reshaped her body, and entered the role so completely that it did not loosen when filming ended. The defining moment, the decision no parent should ever face, stilled the set into silence so complete it felt suspended. No one moved, no one spoke, and something in her did not step out when the scene ended. Later, when she looked back, it was not the scene she returned to, but the place it required her to reach, a place that does not give everything back. The second Oscar followed, but it arrived with a quieter knowing. Some truths I once carried into the light do not return unchanged. What followed did not grow easier, it grew deeper and more demanding in ways few could see. In an industry drawn to surfaces she built from restraint, holding emotion with precision, allowing discomfort to remain intact rather than easing it for comfort. Silkwood narrowed her world into vigilance and contained fear. She withdrew, conserving something internal until little else could enter. Those close to her noticed, not a collapse, but a quiet distance, as if parts of her remained inside the work. In Out of Africa, 1985, she shaped love through absence, letting what was missing speak as clearly as what remained. The film crossed $225 million and earned 7 Academy Awards, yet her presence stayed intimate, almost guarded. Years later, The Devil Wears Prada, 2006, reframed power as distance. Stillness carried isolation without naming it. In The Iron Lady, 2011, she traced not only voice and gesture, but the quiet erosion of identity, the slow fear of becoming unseen, earning her a 3rd Oscar. Across 21 Academy Award nominations and a career measured in global success, one pattern never shifted. The work did not grow lighter. Each role asked for something lived, time given, connections stretched, emotion carried forward rather than set down. Applause gathered, recognition expanded, but none of it reduced what was required to remain at that depth. And somewhere within that continuity, without announcement, without spectacle, she became something more fixed, less reversible, not preserved, not shielded, but permanently shaped by what she had endured, and by what, even now, I still presses quietly beneath the surface, never fully leaving. Recognition had already begun to close in around her life, but what followed did not arrive as reward. It came as something far more exacting, a quiet but relentless demand of what that recognition would ultimately require her to carry. By the mid-1970s, Meryl Streep was no longer unseen, her name moving with growing weight through Broadway corridors and the measured anticipation of film circles. Then in 1976, during a Shakespeare production, she met John Cazale. He was already marked in American cinema as Fredo Corleone, a presence shaped not by strength but by fracture, by a vulnerability that lingered long after the frame ended. Off-screen, he carried that same gravity, brilliant yet fragile, restrained yet deeply felt. Meryl, still in her 20s, did not hesitate. She moved toward him completely. Years later, she would reflect that he possessed a rare clarity, an ability to see beyond ambition into something more essential. There was something in him that recognized me before I could recognize myself, she would later say. Their life together avoided spectacle. It lived in small apartments, worn scripts, rehearsals stretching past midnight, and quiet conversations that existed between moments. 14 years older, carrying histories she had not yet learned to name, he became more than love. He became ground. She would later recall they never spoke of permanence. We stayed inside what we had, she said, and it felt complete enough to trust. That sense of completeness did not last. In early 1977, it fractured without warning. The diagnosis arrived without pause, terminal lung cancer, already advanced. It did not ask what she was ready to lose, it simply began taking. She was 27, her career was rising, doors opening, but she did not move toward them. She moved toward him. She lived beside him, followed him through treatments, through waiting rooms where time narrowed into something unforgiving. When his strength failed, she held what he no longer could. When pain reduced language to silence, she remained inside that silence. During The Deer Hunter, she did more than act. She pushed to keep him working, to keep him present in a life already closing. Those around them remembered not the performance, but the quiet intensity of that fight. As his condition worsened, hospital rooms replaced everything familiar. She slept in chairs, forgot meals, learned the rhythm of machines and the long, unanswering weight of waiting. And there were moments when the world continued untouched, and moments when everything narrowed to the sound of his breathing. On March 12, 1978, John Cazale died at 42. She was there, holding the final moments as they passed, moments that slipped away even as she held them, until the room fell into a stillness so absolute it no longer felt like silence, but absence, and she understood there would be no next breath to wait for. The loss did not arrive loudly, It moved inward, removing something essential, leaving behind a silence no one else could hear. Years later, she would say with quiet clarity, "Loving him was the one thing that felt certain, and losing him never truly found an ending." What came after was not a return, but a quiet reordering of everything that remained. 6 months later, she married sculptor Don Gummer, a longtime friend who had helped her gather what was left when the apartment had become impossible to stay in. To some, the timing felt abrupt. To others, it looked like survival taking shape before collapse could follow. Meryl rarely spoke of John, but when she did, something in her voice seemed to shift, never fully returning to where it had been, as if the past had not gone anywhere, only settled somewhere deeper, out of reach but never out of presence. What stayed with her was not something visible. It did not announce itself, did not ask to be understood. It moved quietly alongside everything else, through work, through life, through the spaces where no one was looking closely enough to see it. It did not interrupt. It did not fade. It simply remained, shaping how she stood, how she continued, how she carried what could not be put down without ever naming it aloud. And perhaps that is what changed most, not what was lost, but how it stayed. Not as something that demanded attention, but as something that refused to leave. Something that would follow her forward, not behind her. Something that would not ask to be healed, only to be carried silently into everything that came next, including the life she had already begun to build before she ever had time to understand what she was bringing with her. What follows loss is not stillness, but a life forced forward before it has learned how to stand again. Barely 6 months after John Cazale slipped away in her arms, Meryl Streep made a choice few outside her world could understand. She married Don Gummer. From a distance, it appeared rushed, even difficult to explain. But to her, it was not replacement. It was a way not to collapse. When something is taken too suddenly, standing still can become the most dangerous thing. Instinct reaches for something solid enough to hold. Dawn did not enter her life as a shadow of what had been lost, but as ground that had not given way, steady, quiet, requiring no explanation. With him, she stepped into a rhythm almost removed from the glare, where days were no longer measured by premieres or applause, but by bedtime stories carried in a softer light. I hurried lunches that dissolved into laughter, and small questions that mattered more than anything the world would ever record. Their 4 children, Mamie Gummer, Grace Gummer, Louisa Gummer, and Henry Wolfe Gummer, grew within that privacy, each finding their own way toward expression, not through expectation, but by living inside a home where creation moved as naturally as breath. It was a kind of happiness that did not announce itself, quiet, continuous, almost weightless in the way it held, built-in glances across a table in shared silences that felt complete rather than empty, in the unspoken certainty of being seen without needing to perform. She did not offer them visibility. She offered presence, listening closely enough that even the most fragile parts of them would not have to disappear to be loved. And while she stood beneath the brightest lights, transforming pain into something unforgettable, as if it had already passed through something like Kramer versus Kramer, where love is not declared but endured, another role unfolded in quiet parallel, a mother holding everything in place, sustaining something that for a time felt whole and undisturbed, even when something within her had not yet found its way back, when parts of her were still living in rooms that no longer existed. And then, as it often does, what is most carefully held begins to shift, not with noise, not with clear signs, but with a distance that forms so gradually it is almost impossible to name when it began. In 2023, the truth she had never needed to tell surfaced at last, that she and Don had been living apart since 2017. 6 years carried without announcement, without explanation, without any attempt to turn a private life into something consumable. No grievances named, no sorrow arranged for understanding. When asked, the answer remained simple, that care was still there. And perhaps it was. But there are distances that do not begin with leaving. They begin while 2 people are still standing in the same life, sharing the same space, yet slowly losing the instinct to reach for one another until even silence feels divided. Conversations grow shorter, pauses stretch longer, and what once felt effortless begins to require effort. Neither of them quite knows how to give, until even the smallest gestures, the ones no one notices until they are gone, fail to return. Until one day, without any single moment to mark it, something essential has already shifted beyond return, not broken in a single instant, but worn away in ways too quiet to stop, too gradual to undo. What remains in this story is not a rupture defined, but the way it reshapes how a person continues, still wearing her wedding band in public, still smiling, still speaking of him with a gentleness measured enough not to disturb what once existed. There is something almost unbearable in that restraint, the quiet discipline of not breaking outward, even when something inward has already shifted beyond repair. In Rare Reflection, she once suggested in her own way that some bonds do not disappear. They simply learn to stand at a distance, far enough not to hinder, yet never entirely gone. There was no explanation offered, no conclusion drawn, only a life continuing, where someone long accustomed to holding everything steady keeps moving forward, even as the ground beneath slowly alters its shape, even as what once felt certain becomes something she must now live beside rather than within. And what lingers is not the moment it changed, but the slow, irreversible understanding that it had already changed long before she could name it, and that no amount of staying could return her to what once felt like home. At the height of her reign, when the industry seemed to bow in recognition, another truth moved beneath the surface. The higher she rose, the more precisely she was measured, questioned, and, at times, diminished. Hollywood celebrated her until the sound became thunder, yet admiration rarely arrived alone. It carried comparison, expectation, and something colder just behind it. To audiences, she was beyond reach. To those beside her, she was harder to hold, someone whose presence reshaped the space itself. The sharpest edges did not come from strangers, but from voices that knew exactly where to strike. Katharine Hepburn dismissed her as cold, overworked, all precision and no pulse. Words that did not question her craft, but hollowed it out, leaving something precise, admired, and quietly lifeless. Susan Sarandon let a quiet fatigue surface, suggesting recognition had lingered in one place too long, and Sharon Stone cut along a different line, questioning not her work but the way she was seen. These were not passing remarks. They landed with precision, each one knowing how deeply it could reach. She never answered. Not publicly, not once, no defense, no correction, only restraint, because she had learned that responding would not lessen what had already been said. Yet silence does not dissolve impact, it absorbs it, and in Rare Reflection she allowed a glimpse beneath that composure. Truth was always what I reached for, but there were moments I understood that truth alone does not protect you. It was not bitterness, it was recognition. Not everything that travels fast is true, and sometimes it arrives before a voice has the chance to rise. On the eve of the Academy Awards, a claim surfaced from Karl Lagerfeld, suggesting she had declined Chanel over payment. It spread with startling speed, headlines forming before clarity had time to catch up. For days, the narrative shifted, not toward her work, not toward the decades that had defined her, but toward something smaller, easier to distort. She spoke once, calm, precise, and the claim began to fall apart. But correction does not erase impression. It lingers, quietly, stubbornly. And beneath it, something deeper settled in. The realization that even a life built with care can be reshaped in moments. Behind the gowns, behind the light, there were spaces where none of that followed her. Backstage, after the applause dissolved, the distance between image and self revealed itself in small, unguarded details. The way her shoulders slowly lowered, as if releasing a weight no one else could see, the stillness that replaced performance, the silence that settled when the room was finally empty. One who stood nearby described it simply. She carried the room while she was in it, and carried something else entirely when she stepped out. It was not collapse, it was release, brief, fragile, and never quite complete. What endures is not what she received, but what she learned to carry without ever setting down. Even those placed on the highest ground do not stand untouched. Over time, she did not harden against it. She absorbed it, shaped it, allowed it to settle into the work itself. Each role held something unspoken, drawn not from invention, but from what had been endured without display. She did not remain because it was easy. She remained because stepping away was never a language she had learned. And what lingers is not the image the world holds, but the quieter reality behind it. A life lived in full view, yet never fully met. Carried forward not because the weight has lessened, but because she has learned to live with what recognition could never hold, because the part of her that carried it had already learned to disappear, long before anyone thought to look for it. Today, at the age of 76, Meryl Streep stands not only as one of the most celebrated actresses in history, but as a woman whose life reflects both extraordinary success and a quiet, carefully guarded reality behind it. With an estimated net worth ranging between $160 million and $180 million, her financial legacy is built not on excess, but on decades of disciplined choices, thoughtful investments, and an unwavering commitment to her craft. Unlike many in her position, her wealth does not announce itself loudly. It settles into spaces she has chosen with intention, into homes designed not for display but for retreat. It is a fortune shaped by endurance as much as achievement, a structure that feels less like accumulation and more like something built to hold what could not be set down. And her real estate tells that story more honestly than any public statement ever could. At the center is her 90-acre estate in Salisbury, valued at over $10 million, a place where stone walls, long wooded paths, and open fields create a world that seems intentionally removed from time itself. This is where her children grew up, where laughter once moved from room to room, where life once filled every space. The house carries a quiet, grounded beauty, wood, light, and stillness. But now the same hallways stretch longer, the same rooms hold more silence than before. She once owned a glass-wrapped penthouse in Tribeca overlooking the Hudson River, later sold for a multi-million-dollar gain, as if stepping away from a life that demanded constant presence. In Pasadena, her mid-century modern home remains elegant and restrained, and another place to stay but never quite to belong. Across every property, one pattern remains clear: privacy over prestige, distance over display. Even her choice of vehicles, luxury sedans like Mercedes-Benz and Lexus, reflects the same instinct, not to be seen, but simply to move without interruption. Her life now moves to a rhythm far removed from the urgency that once defined her career. Surrounded by her children, Mamie, Grace, Louisa, and Henry, and the quiet continuation of family through grandchildren, she remains present in ways that do not need to be documented. There are no cameras in those moments, no scripts to follow, only the small, steady rituals of a life lived off stage. A kitchen that once felt full now shifts with changing schedules. Voices that once overlapped now arrive in intervals, some days fuller, some days quieter than she remembers. And somewhere within that rhythm, there are absences that never fully settled: the loss of John Cazale that never truly left her, and the quiet separation from Dawn Gummer, a marriage that endured for decades yet has lived apart since 2017, never formally ended, only redefined in silence. She has never spoken of it in detail, but its presence lingers in the way certain spaces feel slightly unoccupied, in the way continuity sometimes exists without closeness. She has never pushed her children toward fame, yet each carries something of her into their own paths, not through instruction but through proximity. Her health remains stable, supported by simplicity, walks instead of intensity, balance instead of control. She does not attempt to reverse time, she allows it. Her appearance reflects that same decision, lines not erased but lived through, a face that carries memory rather than hiding it. And perhaps that is where everything settles now, not in what has changed, but in what remains, quietly present. moving alongside her without needing to be named, shaping a life that continues not by forgetting, but by learning how to hold what never entirely lets go. Professionally, she has not disappeared, only stepped back with intention. Her role in Only Murders in the Building reminded audiences that her presence still holds quiet authority, that she does not need volume to be felt. She continues to support causes tied to education, women's history, and the arts, contributing millions over time without turning generosity into performance. There is no urgency left in how she works, no need to prove anything further. Even the matter of legacy, her estate, her future planning, remains private, handled with the same restraint that has defined every chapter of her life. What she leaves behind is not something she speaks about openly, but something already taking shape in the people and the work that will remain after her. And yet, beyond all of this, beyond the homes, the wealth, the legacy, what defines Meryl Streep now is not what she holds, but how she continues while carrying what never left. The losses, the years that demanded more than they returned, the spaces that changed without announcement, none of these are visible, yet all of them remain. She does not present them, she moves with them. And perhaps that is what stays with us, not the scale of her success, but the quiet realization that a life admired from the outside is often sustained by things no one ever sees. If her work has ever touched you, then take a moment, not just to celebrate what she achieved, but to recognize what she carried to get there. Leave a word, a memory, a simple tribute below, because sometimes the most extraordinary lives are not defined by what they gained, but by what they learned to carry without ever asking to be understood.